The sun had barely crested the horizon on April 8, 2025, when the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. began to hum with the energy of another chaotic news cycle. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of cherry blossoms that lingered from the previous week's bloom, a stark contrast to the brewing storm within the press corps. Among the throngs of journalists scrambling for their next scoop was Ethan Caldwell, a seasoned reporter known for his sharp tongue and unshakable confidence. Ethan had spent over a decade climbing the ranks of a prominent cable news network, earning a reputation as a fearless, if not reckless, voice in political journalism. His colleagues admired his tenacity, but his detractors, of which there were many, saw him as an arrogant relic of a bygone era, clinging to relevance in a rapidly shifting media landscape. Today, however, would mark a turning point in his career, one that would ripple through the halls of power and the screens of millions. For those who haven't yet witnessed the drama unfold, the story of Ethan's downfall is one worth watching, especially if you adore Karoline, the fiery protagonist at the heart of this tale. If you love Karoline, subscribe to the channel now to catch every twist and turn of her journey. Ethan's morning began like any other, a triple-shot espresso from a corner cafe near the White House, a quick scan of the day's briefing schedule, and a mental checklist of the questions he'd hurl at Karoline Leavitt, the newly appointed White House press secretary. At just 27 years old, Karoline had already become a polarizing figure in Washington. To her supporters, she was a breath of fresh air, a bold, unapologetic voice for a new administration that promised to shake up the status quo. To her critics, she was an inexperienced upstart, thrust into a role far beyond her depth by a president who valued loyalty over competence. Ethan fell firmly into the latter camp. He'd covered press secretaries of every stripe, veterans like Jay Carney and rookies like Sean Spicer, but none had irked him quite like Karoline. Her youth, her poise, and her refusal to bend under pressure gnawed at him, fueling a personal vendetta he barely bothered to conceal. The White House briefing room was packed that Tuesday morning, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters jostled for seats, their laptops open and cameras rolling, as Karoline strode to the podium with her trademark confidence. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned back, and her navy blazer exuded authority. She began with a prepared statement about the administration's latest economic policy, a tariff announcement that had Wall Street buzzing and the press corps salivating for details. Ethan sat near the front, his notebook scribbled with pointed questions designed to trip her up. He'd spent the previous night researching the intricacies of trade policy, determined to expose what he saw as Karoline's lack of expertise. To him, she was a mouthpiece, not a policymaker, and he intended to prove it. "Ms. Leavitt," Ethan called out as soon as she opened the floor to questions, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "The president's tariff plan has been criticized by economists as a tax hike on American consumers, not foreign entities. Can you explain how this administration justifies that contradiction?" His tone was smug, his posture leaning forward as if daring her to falter. Karoline met his gaze, unflinching. "Ethan, I'd be happy to clarify," she replied, her voice steady. "The president's tariffs are a strategic tool to level the playing field. Foreign countries have exploited us for decades. The revenue stays here, wages rise, and American wealth grows. It's a tax cut for our people, not a hike." Her response was crisp, rehearsed, and delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ethan wasn't satisfied. He pressed harder, his arrogance bubbling to the surface. "With all due respect, Ms. Leavitt, have you ever paid a tariff yourself? Because I have. They hit importers, not foreign companies, and those costs get passed to us. Are you saying the president doesn't understand basic economics, or is that you?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It wasn't just a question. It was an insult, dripping with condescension. Karoline's smile vanished, replaced by a steely glare. "I think it's insulting that you'd try to test my knowledge, or the president's, on a policy that's already lifting this country up," she shot back. "The American people haven't seen fair trade in decades, and that changes now. I regret even giving you the floor, Ethan." The exchange crackled with tension, a verbal sparring match broadcast live to millions. For Ethan, it was a moment of triumph. He'd rattled her, or so he thought. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as other reporters jumped in with their own questions. But behind the podium, Karoline's mind was racing. She'd dealt with hostile press before, but Ethan's barb felt personal, a deliberate attempt to humiliate her on a national stage. She made a mental note to address it later, though she couldn't have predicted how swiftly the situation would escalate. For the rest of the briefing, Ethan sat quietly, scribbling notes and plotting his next move. He had no idea he'd just lit the fuse on his own career's demise. By midday, the clip of their confrontation was everywhere. Cable news, social media, even the late-night talk show circuits. Pundits dissected every word, with some praising Ethan's fearless journalism and others condemning his arrogant grandstanding. On X, the hashtag Ethan versus Karoline trended worldwide, splitting the internet into factions. Karoline's supporters rallied behind her, flooding her mentions with praise for her composure. "She shut him down like a boss," one user wrote, attaching a gif of a mic drop. Ethan's fans, meanwhile, hailed him as a truth-teller unafraid to challenge power. Finally, someone calls out the White House's nonsense, another posted. But beneath the noise, a storm was brewing at Ethan's network, where executives were less than pleased with the optics. That afternoon, Ethan's producer called him into a meeting. The office was a sleek, glass-walled space overlooking the Potomac, but the atmosphere was anything but serene. "What the hell were you thinking?" his producer, Maria Torres, demanded, slamming a tablet onto the desk. The screen showed a still of Ethan's smirk during the briefing, captioned with a scathing editorial from a rival outlet, "Reporter's ego overshadows news." Ethan shrugged, unfazed. "I asked a tough question, Maria. That's my job." She couldn't handle it. Maria's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to report, not to play gotcha with the press secretary. You made us look petty, not her. The network's getting hammered, advertisers are spooked, and the White House is threatening to freeze us out." Ethan scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "They won't freeze us out. They need us more than we need them." But Maria wasn't buying it. She'd seen the writing on the wall. The administration had already barred another outlet, the Associated Press, from Oval Office events over a naming dispute. Ethan's stunt risked putting their network in the same crosshairs. "You don't get it," she said, her voice low. "This isn't about you winning a debate. It's about credibility. You crossed a line, and now we're paying for it." She paused, then delivered the blow. "The higher-ups want you gone. You're fired, effective immediately." The words hit Ethan like a freight train. Fired? After 12 years of breaking stories, chasing leads, and building a name for himself? He opened his mouth to protest, but Maria cut him off. "Don't bother. Security's waiting outside. Clear your desk." Stunned, Ethan stumbled out of the office, his mind reeling. He'd expected backlash, maybe a suspension, but not this. As he packed his belongings, dog-eared notebooks, a framed award from 2018, a half-empty coffee mug, his colleagues avoided his gaze, their whispers filling the silence. By the time he reached the elevator, the reality had sunk in. His career, as he knew it, was over. News of Ethan's firing spread like wildfire. By evening, every major outlet had the story, with headlines ranging from "Reporter Sacked After Clash with Press Secretary" to "Arrogance Costs Journalist His Job." Karoline, meanwhile, remained silent, letting the administration's actions speak for themselves. In a brief statement, a White House spokesperson confirmed the network's access would be re-evaluated, a veiled threat that sent chills through the press corps. Ethan's supporters decried it as censorship, while Karoline's fans cheered it as justice. "He messed with the wrong woman," one ex-user wrote, alongside a photo of Karoline at the podium. For Ethan, the days that followed were a blur of regret and defiance. Holed up in his DuPont Circle apartment, he watched the world move on without him. Job offers dried up, his reputation, once a badge of honor, now a liability. He fired off angry posts on X, railing against cancel culture and the Trump machine, but the tide had turned. Friends urged him to apologize, to salvage what he could, but Ethan refused. "I don't grovel," he told a former colleague over beers one night. "I said what I said." Yet beneath the bravado, doubt crept in. Had he misjudged Karoline? Had his ego blinded him to the shifting sands of journalism? Karoline, on the other hand, emerged stronger than ever. The incident cemented her as a force to be reckoned with, a press secretary who wouldn't be bullied or belittled. In the weeks that followed, she leaned into her role, sparring with reporters and defending the administration's agenda with a tenacity that won her grudging respect, even from critics. Behind closed doors, she confided in aides about the encounter. "He thought he could break me," she said, sipping coffee in the West Wing. "But I've been underestimated before." Her resolve only deepened, a quiet vow to outlast anyone who dared challenge her. As spring turned to summer, Ethan faded from the spotlight, a cautionary tale for a new generation of journalists. Karoline, meanwhile, continued to command the briefing room, her presence a reminder of the power dynamics at play. The clash that ended Ethan's career became a footnote in her rise, a moment that defined not just her strength, but the unforgiving nature of Washington itself. For Ethan, it was a bitter lesson in hubris. For Karoline, it was proof that arrogance, unchecked, always meets its match. Months later, on a quiet evening in July, Ethan sat alone in a dimly lit bar, nursing a whiskey and scrolling through X. A clip of Karoline's latest briefing popped up, her voice sharp, her demeanor unshakable. He watched for a moment, then set the phone down, staring into the amber liquid. "She won," he muttered to himself, the words tasting like ash. Across town, Karoline prepared for another day at the podium, her notes spread across her desk, her mind already 3 steps ahead. The reporter who tried to take her down was gone, but the game, the endless, brutal game, rolled on. And so, the story of Ethan Caldwell and Karoline Leavitt became legend in the annals of DC lore, a tale of pride, power, and the perilous line between ambition and ruin. For every reporter who stepped into that briefing room after, it lingered as a warning: underestimate Karoline at your peril. For every viewer who tuned in, it was a spectacle of justice, a reminder that in the arena of politics and press, only the resilient survive. The bar where Ethan sat that July evening became a sort of refuge in the months that followed, a dimly lit sanctuary where he could escape the relentless churn of the news cycle he'd once dominated. The bartender, a gruff man named Tony who'd seen his share of fallen giants, slid a fresh whiskey across the counter without a word. Ethan nodded in thanks, his eyes drifting to the muted TV above the bar. There she was again, Karoline, commanding the screen with that same unshakable poise, fielding questions about a new immigration policy with the precision of a seasoned general. He couldn't help but marvel at her staying power. What he'd dismissed as youthful bravado had hardened into something formidable, a resilience he hadn't anticipated. It gnawed at him, the realization that she'd turned his attack into her armor. Across town, Karoline's days grew longer, her responsibilities heavier, but she thrived under the pressure. The West Wing had become her proving ground, a battlefield where every briefing was a chance to solidify her legacy. She'd taken to keeping a small notebook in her pocket, jotting down observations about the reporters who filled the room. Their quirks, their biases, their tells. Ethan's name was still there, scrawled in black ink with a single word beside it: arrogance. It wasn't a vendetta, not anymore. It was a reminder of the stakes, a lesson etched into her rise. She'd learned early that Washington rewarded those who could turn a wound into a weapon, and she intended to wield hers well. Ethan's phone buzzed incessantly those days, a cruel symphony of notifications he couldn't bring himself to silence. Old colleagues reached out with half-hearted offers of freelance gigs, pity assignments, really. While trolls on X reveled in his demise, their taunts a constant hum in the background. "Guess you're not so tough without a mic, huh?" one read. He'd type out fiery retorts, only to delete them before hitting send. What was the point? The platform that had once amplified his voice now buried it beneath a flood of memes and hot takes. He'd become a punchline, a cautionary tale traded over beers at press happy hours. Don't pull an Ethan. Meanwhile, Karoline's star continued to climb, her name whispered in the halls of power as a potential contender for bigger things. Aides speculated she'd run for office someday, maybe a House seat, or even governor of her home state, New Hampshire. She brushed off the chatter with a laugh, insisting she was focused on the job at hand, but the ambition in her eyes betrayed her. The Ethan incident had been a crucible, forging her into a figure the administration couldn't ignore. When the president called her into the Oval Office one sweltering August afternoon to commend her handling of the press, she felt the weight of possibility settle on her shoulders. "You're tougher than they think," he'd said, a rare grin breaking across his face. She'd smiled back, knowing he was right. Ethan's apartment, once a stylish bachelor pad filled with the trappings of success, had devolved into a cluttered mess of takeout containers and unopened mail. He'd stopped shaving, his once crisp suits replaced by threadbare sweatshirts. Friends tried to stage interventions, dragging him to dinners or pitching him to editors at smaller outlets, but he waved them off. "I'm not begging for scraps," he'd snap, his pride a stubborn anchor dragging him deeper into isolation. Yet late at night, when the city slept and the whiskey softened the edges of his anger, he'd replay that briefing in his mind. The moment he'd gone too far, the smirk that had sealed his fate. Regret crept in, uninvited but persistent. Karoline, by contrast, was everywhere. Her face on magazine covers, her voice on podcasts, her presence a fixture in the national conversation. A profile in The Atlantic dubbed her the Iron Voice of the White House, a title she found amusing but secretly cherished. She'd started mentoring younger staffers, sharing the hard-earned wisdom of her first year on the job. "Never let them see you sweat," she'd tell them, echoing advice her father had given her back in New Hampshire. The Ethan episode came up often in those sessions, not as a boast, but as a case study in resilience. "He thought he'd break me," she'd say, "but he only made me sharper." By fall, Ethan's savings had dwindled, forcing him to face a reckoning. He took a gig writing clickbait for a dubious online outlet, listicles about top 10 White House scandals and secrets they don't want you to know. It paid the rent, barely, but it was a far cry from the bylines he'd once chased. Colleagues from his old network spotted him at a press event one crisp October day, lurking on the fringes with a cheap recorder and a haunted look. They didn't approach. The sight of Ethan Caldwell, reduced to a shadow of his former self, was too jarring. Word spread quickly, a quiet murmur through the press corps. The mighty had fallen, and there was no climbing back. Karoline's influence, meanwhile, extended beyond the briefing room. She'd begun shaping the administration's messaging strategy, working late into the night with policy advisors to craft narratives that resonated with a restless public. Her clash with Ethan had taught her the power of perception, how a single moment could define a career, for better or worse. She leaned into it, turning every press encounter into a performance, a chess match she refused to lose. When a rival reporter tried a similar stunt in November, questioning her credentials with a sneer, she shut it down with a single line, "I've been underestimated before. It didn't end well for the last guy." The room erupted in laughter, the ghost of Ethan hovering unspoken. For Ethan, the final blow came in December, when his old network aired a year-end retrospective. There he was, frozen in that infamous clip, his smirk a relic of a lost era. The segment framed him as a symbol of journalism's excesses, a foil to Karoline's triumph. He watched from his couch, the whiskey bottle empty beside him, as the anchor intoned, "Sometimes, the story isn't the question, it's the one asking it." He turned off the TV, the silence swallowing him whole. For the first time, he wondered if he'd been wrong, not just about Karoline, but about himself. As 2025 drew to a close, Karoline stood at a White House holiday reception, a glass of champagne in hand, surrounded by allies and admirers. The room buzzed with warmth and celebration, but her mind was already on the year ahead. New battles, new victories. Ethan's name rarely crossed her thoughts anymore. He was a footnote, a stepping stone on her path. Across the city, Ethan sat alone in the dark, the glow of his phone illuminating a draft apology he'd never send. Two lives, once briefly tangled, had diverged forever. One rising, one fading, both shaped by a single fateful exchange. The new year dawned cold and gray over Washington, a fitting backdrop for Ethan's quiet unraveling. The holiday reception Karoline had attended marked the pinnacle of her ascent, while Ethan's solitude underscored his nadir. He'd spent New Year's Eve alone, the distant pop of fireworks a mocking reminder of the celebrations he'd once covered as a star reporter. The unsent apology lingered on his phone, a digital ghost he couldn't exorcise. By January 2nd, desperation drove him to action, not to send it, but to rewrite his story. He began pitching a memoir to publishers, a raw, unfiltered account of his rise and fall titled Byline for Survival. It was a long shot, but it was something, a lifeline to reclaim his voice, or at least his dignity. Karoline, meanwhile, entered 2026 with a renewed sense of purpose. The holiday break had been brief, a mere pause before the administration launched an ambitious legislative agenda. She stood at the forefront, briefing the press on a sweeping infrastructure plan that promised jobs and headlines. Her performance was flawless, her answers sharp and her demeanor unflappable. The Ethan incident, now a year old, had faded into the background for most, but it remained a quiet fuel for her fire. She'd turned it into a mantra. No one would catch her off guard again. Behind the scenes, she'd begun cultivating a network of allies, senators, donors, even a few sympathetic reporters, laying the groundwork for a future she could almost taste. Ethan's memoir pitch met with tepid interest at first. Publishers saw potential in the scandal but hesitated at his tarnished name. "You're a liability," one editor told him bluntly over coffee in a DuPont Circle cafe. "Readers want redemption, not bitterness." The words stung, but they lit a spark. Ethan retreated to his apartment and poured himself into the draft, writing late into the night. He dissected his career, the scoops, the feuds, the fateful day he'd crossed Karoline. He didn't shy away from his flaws, laying bare the arrogance that had blinded him. It was cathartic, a confession in ink, but he couldn't shake the fear that it was too late to matter. In the White House, Karoline's influence grew more pronounced. She wasn't just a press secretary anymore. She was a strategist, a confidant to the president, a player in the game. When a crisis erupted in February, a leaked memo suggesting internal dissent over the infrastructure plan, she took the podium with a calm that silenced the room. "The administration is united," she declared, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is noise, not news." The press pushed back, but she held firm, turning the narrative in the president's favor. Pundits marveled at her skill. Even her old critics began to concede she was more than a figurehead. Ethan's name came up in one post-briefing analysis, a fleeting comparison. "She's what he could have been, if he'd had half her discipline." Ethan's manuscript took shape by spring, a 300-page reckoning that surprised even him with its honesty. He sent it to a small independent press willing to take a chance, and to his shock, they bit. Byline for Survival was slated for release in late 2026, a modest print run with no guarantees. The advance barely covered his rent, but it was a start. He hired a publicist, a scrappy young woman named Lila who saw potential in his story, and began plotting a comeback. "We lean into the fall," she told him, her eyes gleaming. "People love a train wreck if it gets back on the tracks." Ethan wasn't sure he believed her, but he had nothing left to lose. Karoline's trajectory, by contrast, seemed unstoppable. In June, she led a press tour through the Midwest, touting the infrastructure plan's early wins: new bridges, revived factories, jobs trickling back to Rust Belt towns. Crowds cheered her, reporters trailed her, and the president beamed at her side. She'd become a symbol of the administration's promise, a fresh face for a weary nation. Back in D.C., whispers of her running for Senate grew louder, fueled by a viral clip of her sparring with a heckler in Ohio. "I don't back down," she'd said, her voice steady as steel, and the internet turned it into a rallying cry. Ethan's shadow lingered in those moments, a faint echo of the fight that had forged her. The release of Byline for Survival in November 2026 was a quiet affair, overshadowed by midterm election frenzy. Ethan did a handful of podcasts and bookstore signings, his voice hoarse but resolute. The book sold modestly, enough to earn a few glowing reviews and a smattering of hate mail, but it stirred something unexpected. Readers reached out, some empathizing with his hubris, others thanking him for the glimpse behind the curtain. One letter, from a journalism student in Texas, stuck with him: "You fell, but you got up. That's what matters." He kept it on his desk, a small anchor against the tide of doubt. Karoline's name filled the pages, not as a villain, but as a mirror, a reflection of what he'd failed to become. Karoline, now a household name, watched the midterms from the White House, her fingerprints on every victory speech. The administration gained seats, defying predictions, and her stock soared. In December, she sat down for a rare personal interview with Vogue, her first since taking the job. The reporter asked about Ethan, probing the old wound. "He was a moment," she said, her tone dismissive yet measured. "I don't dwell on moments, I build on them." The quote made headlines, a subtle jab that reignited debates. Ethan saw it on his feed and smirked, a flicker of his old fire. "Touché," he muttered, closing the app. By 2027, Ethan had clawed his way to a fragile stability. The book's buzz landed him a part-time gig teaching journalism at a community college, a far cry from the newsroom but a chance to mold minds instead of headlines. Students asked about Karoline often, fascinated by the duel that defined his story. He'd shrug, offering a wry smile. "She won. I didn't. That's the lesson." Meanwhile, he kept writing op-eds, mostly, for niche outlets willing to take his byline. It wasn't glory, but it was purpose, a slow rebuild from the ashes of his arrogance. Karoline's path, by then, was stratospheric. In March 2027, she announced her resignation as press secretary, confirming rumors of a Senate run in New Hampshire. The president endorsed her, calling her the future of this country, and the party rallied behind her. Campaigning came naturally. She was tough, charismatic, unbreakable. Ethan watched from afar, his book now a footnote in her legend. Their clash, once a scandal, had become a parable. One fell, one rose, and the world turned on. In a quiet moment, he raised a glass to her, alone in his apartment. "To the better player," he said, and drank deeply.